The moment Opal Wainwright realized the man she had traveled 800 miles to marry was never coming, she felt the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with the 3 days she had gone without a proper meal. She sat on the hard wooden bench at the Abilene depot, her white dress yellowed at the hem from the dust of the Kansas plains, her dark hair pinned so carefully that morning by lamplight in the train's cramped washroom. The dress had belonged to her mother, let out at the waist and taken in at the shoulders, and it smelled faintly of cedar and something older than that, something that reminded her of a life back in Virginia that no longer existed. The year was 1873, and the summer heat pressed down on the Kansas territory like a hand flat against the earth, and Opal Wainwright sat alone in it with 22 cents in her coin purse, and a trunk full of wedding hope that now seemed like the most embarrassing thing she had ever packed. Around her, the depot breathed with life. Cowboys fresh off the Kisham Trail stomped through in boots caked with dried mud, their spurs singing against the floorboards. Cattle buyers in clean linen suits moved with purpose toward the stock pens. Women with parasols and children pulling at their skirts passed in and out of the wedge of afternoon shadow cast by the depot's narrow overhang. A station agent with a red mustache and ink-stained fingers shouted departure times over the general noise, and somewhere outside, a horse complained loudly about something, and was answered by another horse with equal feeling. Opal had arrived on the morning train from St. Louis, which had connected from Richmond, Virginia, where she had boarded with her trunk and her letter of introduction and her carefully folded contract from the matrimonial agency. The letter from Harlan Beckett had been warm and specific. He had described himself as a widower of 41 with a cattle operation outside of Abilene, a man who wanted a steady and educated woman to help him run a proper household. He had sent her passage money. He had signed the letter with a flourish that suggested confidence. He had not come to meet the train. She had waited through the morning and into the afternoon. She had asked the station agent twice whether there had been any messages left for Opal Wainwright, and twice the man with the red mustache had checked his board and shaken his head without particular sympathy. She had walked to the edge of the platform and looked down the main road into Abilene, as if looking hard enough might conjure the man she expected. And when that failed, she had come back inside and sat down again, and folded her hands in her lap like a woman who was not frightened at all. But she was frightened. She had spent the last of her own money on the train ticket from Richmond to St. Louis, trusting that Harlan Beckett's passage voucher would carry her the rest of the way. She had 2 biscuits left from the food she had wrapped in cloth at the beginning of the journey, and she had eaten the last one that morning before the train pulled into Abilene, because she had told herself she would surely be eating a proper supper tonight as a married woman. Now the supper seemed as far away as Virginia, and her stomach had moved past growling into a kind of quiet, hollow ache that she recognized from the lean years after the war, when her father's farm had produced more debt than food, and she had learned to go to bed counting her blessings instead of her hunger. The afternoon light shifted. The depot thinned out. The station agent began to look at her in a way that suggested he was working up to asking her something, and she could not bear to hear whatever it was going to be. So she stared at the wall across from her with great intensity, as though she were reading something written there. She was so focused on the wall that she almost did not feel the small tug at her sleeve. It was gentle and tentative, the kind of tug that a person makes when they are not sure they have the right person and do not want to cause offense if they are wrong. She looked down. A boy stood beside her bench, maybe 9 or 10 years old, with his father's dark hair and his father's square jaw and his own particular pair of serious gray eyes that seemed to take careful stock of everything they landed on. He wore a clean shirt that had been pressed with some effort and trousers that were a little short at the ankle and boots that were real boots, the kind that cost something. He held his hat in both hands in front of him, turning it slowly the way a person does when they are nervous but trying to appear otherwise. "Are you Miss Opal Wainwright?" he asked. His voice was earnest and a little formal, the way a boy's voice gets when he has been given an important errand and intends to carry it out correctly. "I am," she said, and she could hear something fragile in her own voice that she immediately tried to shore up with a steadier breath. The boy's face changed, relief washing over it like a small sunrise. "Papa sent me," he said. "He said I should find a woman in a white dress sitting at the depot and tell her he is sorry he is late and that he is coming, but it took longer than he thought, and I should walk with you to get something to eat because he did not want you to wait hungry." Opal blinked. She opened her mouth and then closed it again. "Your papa," she said carefully. "And who is your papa?" "Oliver Quinn," the boy said, and then, as if this needed clarifying, "He owns the Red Cedar Ranch about 11 miles out." "I am Charlie Quinn. I am 9 years old and I rode in myself because Papa's horse threw a shoe at Miller's Creek, and he had to walk her slow the rest of the way so as not to lame her." He delivered this information with the gravity of a man presenting testimony in a court of law. Opal absorbed this quietly. "I believe," she said slowly, "that I may be waiting for a different man. I was to meet a Mr. Harlan Beckett." Charlie Quinn's expression shifted into something more complicated. He scrunched his nose slightly. "Beckett," he said, and then seemed to make a decision about how much to say. "Papa knows Beckett. Everybody knows Beckett." He left the rest of that sentence conspicuously empty, which told Opal more than any completed thought might have. "Then why did your father send you to find me?" she asked. Charlie turned his hat another slow revolution. "Because Papa saw Beckett at the saloon last night, and Beckett was talking about how he had decided the matrimonial scheme was a bad idea, and he wasn't going through with it, but he had already cashed the agency's fee, and he wasn't going to bother sending a telegram because the woman was just some Virginia girl he had never met anyway." Charlie paused. Papa was not pleased when he heard that. He used some words I am not supposed to repeat. And then he said that was a terrible thing to do to a person, and somebody ought to go and see the woman was all right. And since he had business in town today anyway, he said he would go himself. And then his horse threw the shoe. Opal felt a slow heat move through her chest that was part fury and part something else she could not immediately name. She thought of Harlan Beckett, whom she had never met, sitting in a saloon in Abilene last night while she was on a train somewhere in Missouri, watching the dark plains roll past and thinking about what her wedding morning would look like. She thought of him deciding she was just some Virginia girl he had never met anyway, and she felt the fury solidify into something colder and harder and more manageable. She looked at Charlie Quinn, who was watching her with those careful gray eyes as if he understood that she was in the middle of working something out and did not want to interrupt. "Your father," she said at last, "sounds like a decent man." Charlie considered this with genuine seriousness. "He is all right," he said, which she would later learn was the highest praise Charlie Quinn typically offered anyone. She stood up. Her legs were stiff from the long sitting, and her dress was wrinkled from the traveling, and her stomach was making its feelings known in no uncertain terms. But she straightened herself to her full height, which was not particularly impressive, but felt significant in the moment. "Then I suppose I will let you take me somewhere to eat," she said, "and wait to meet your father." Charlie nodded with evident satisfaction and turned toward the door with the air of a boy who has completed his mission successfully. Opal picked up her small travel bag, the one she had kept with her rather than checking with the trunk, and followed him out into the full weight of the Kansas afternoon. The town of Abilene in 1873 was a place caught between two lives, still swaggering from its years as the roughest cattle shipping point on the continent, but beginning to put on the airs of a proper town as the cattle trade shifted westward, and the more permanent residents started to assert themselves. There were real businesses now alongside the saloons and gambling houses, a proper hotel and a millinery and a druggist and 2 churches competing cheerfully for the souls of the citizenry. The streets were still unpaved and still full of horses, and still loud with the particular noise of a frontier town that had not entirely made up its mind about what it wanted to be. But there were flower boxes on some of the windowsills, and that counted for something. Charlie led her to a restaurant called Hattie's that occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on Cedar Street. And Opal understood within 10 feet of the door that Charlie Quinn had been here many times before because the woman who ran the place, a stout red-headed woman of about 50 with flour on her apron, called out, "Charlie Quinn, sit yourself down. Where is your father?" Without even looking up from the counter she was wiping. "Horse threw a shoe at Miller's Creek," Charlie reported, climbing onto a stool with the familiarity of long practice. "He is coming. This is Miss Opal Wainwright. She came from Virginia." Hattie finally looked up, and she had a face that had seen considerable weather and developed considerable opinions as a result, but her eyes were sharp and kind in equal measure. She took in Opal's white dress and her travel bag and the set of her chin in one sweeping assessment, and then nodded once as if she had reached a verdict. "Sit down, honey," she said. "I will get you a plate." "I want you to know that I can pay," Opal began, because the 22 cents in her purse was not nothing even if it was not much, and she had her pride left even if she did not have much else at the moment. Hattie waved a hand at her like she was shooing a fly. "Charlie Quinn's family eats at my establishment on account, and his father settles it at the end of every month regular as rainfall, so you sit down and stop fretting." There was something so matter-of-fact about the woman's generosity that it bypassed Opal's defenses entirely and hit her somewhere soft and unprepared. She sat down on the stool next to Charlie and felt the exhaustion of the last 3 days settle over her like a blanket. Hattie brought chicken and dumplings and cornbread and coffee, and Opal ate with a self-control that cost her a significant effort because she was hungry enough to have eaten the plate as well. Charlie ate with the cheerful efficiency of a growing boy who rarely turned down food, and between bites, he told her things about Abilene and the surrounding country with the informative air of a person who believes information is always useful. She learned that the Red Cedar Ranch had about 400 head of cattle and 3 full-time hands, and a cook named Domingo who made extraordinary frijoles. She learned that Charlie's mother had died of fever 3 winters ago, and that Charlie had been 8 at the time, and remembered it clearly. He said this without asking for sympathy, the way a child says a hard thing when they have learned to carry it without making other people uncomfortable. She learned that his father had been running the ranch alone since then, and that the place had a good house, stone-built, with a porch on the front that faced west so you could see the sunset over the grassland. She was absorbing all of this and reaching the end of her cornbread when the door of Hattie's restaurant opened and Oliver Quinn walked in. She knew it was him before Charlie said anything, before there was any introduction at all. She knew it the way you know a thing that is self-evident, the way you know what a word means even when you encounter it in an unfamiliar sentence. He was 32 years old, tall in a way that was proportional rather than ungainly, with the kind of build that comes from genuine outdoor work rather than any deliberate effort toward it. His hair was the same dark color as his son's, pushed back from his forehead under a hat that he removed as he came through the door. He had been riding, clearly, and walking after that, and he looked it, but underneath the trail dust he had the face of a man who was accustomed to weighing things honestly before he spoke. He was looking for her, she could see that. His eyes moved across the restaurant with a careful focus, and when they landed on her they stopped. She looked back at him and did not look away, because she was a woman from Virginia who had traveled 800 miles in a wedding dress and had 22 cents in her purse, and she was past the point of pretending that anything about her current situation was ordinary. He crossed the restaurant in a few strides and stopped in front of her and held out his hand. "Miss Wainwright," he said, "I am Oliver Quinn. I am sorry I am late, and I am sorry about Beckett. That was a poor thing he did to you." His voice was a Western voice, unhurried, with a directness that was not unkind. She took his hand and shook it. "Mr. Quinn," she said, "your son found me before I had entirely given up hope. You raised him well." Something shifted in Oliver Quinn's face, a small private warmth. He glanced at Charlie, who was working on a second piece of cornbread with tremendous concentration. "He told you about the horse," Oliver said. "It was not quite a question." "In considerable detail," she said. He sat down across from her, and Hattie materialized with coffee and a plate without being asked, which told Opal that this was indeed a man who came here often. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and looked at her with those steady gray eyes, which were older than Charlie's, but had the same quality of taking things in carefully before arriving at a judgment. "I want to say something plainly, if you will permit it," he said. "I prefer plain to otherwise," she said. "What Beckett did was wrong. You should not be left in a strange town without resources after traveling that distance on his word. I do not know what your situation is, and I do not need to know all of it, but if you need a place to stay while you decide what comes next, the Red Cedar Ranch has a spare room and you are welcome to it for as long as you need. There is no obligation attached to that offer. It is simply the decent thing." She studied him for a long moment. Outside, through Hattie's window, the main street of Abilene went about its business in the golden light of late afternoon. A wagon rumbled past. Two men argued amiably in front of the hardware store. Somewhere down the street, a piano was being played with more enthusiasm than precision. "You are a stranger, Mr. Quinn," she said. "I arrived this morning to marry a man I had never met based on correspondence and an agency contract. You will forgive me if I am cautious about accepting hospitality from another stranger before I have had time to assess the situation." "That is entirely fair," he said, without any offense in his voice at all. "I am not asking you to trust me on no evidence. I am only asking you to consider that you have options that do not involve sleeping in this depot." Charlie looked up from his cornbread. "Hattie, would you tell her Papa is trustworthy?" he asked, with the matter-of-fact confidence of a boy who understands exactly which adults in his world carry authority. Hattie, who had been openly listening to the entire conversation from behind her counter, made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a confirmation. "Oliver Quinn is as straight as they come in this county," she said. "He pays his debts and he does not lie, and he has raised that boy alone for 3 years without complaining about it, which is more than I can say for most men in this territory." She paused. "Harlan Beckett, on the other hand, has owed me for a pie since February." Opal felt the corner of her mouth move despite herself. She looked at Oliver Quinn, who had the expression of a man who is trying not to appear to be hoping for anything particular. "I will accept your hospitality for 1 week," she said. "No more than that. I will need that time to write to the agency and determine what my options are, and I will help with whatever work needs doing on the ranch in exchange for my room and board. I do not take charity. I did not offer charity," he said. "I offered a room. There is a difference." "I am glad we are agreed on that point," she said. And that, improbably, was how Opal Wainwright came to arrive at the Red Cedar Ranch on the evening of June the 14th, 1873, seated on the bench of Oliver Quinn's wagon beside Charlie Quinn, who fell asleep against her shoulder sometime after the 2nd mile, and did not wake when she carefully shifted to accommodate him, and looked out at the Kansas grassland rolling away from the road in every direction under a sky full of more stars than she had seen in her entire life in Virginia. Oliver drove in a comfortable silence, and once, when she turned to say something about the stars, she found him already looking at her with an expression she did not yet have enough information to interpret. She said something about the stars anyway, and he agreed that they were something out here, and they rode the rest of the way to the ranch in a quiet that felt, surprisingly, less like the silence between strangers and more like the silence between people who are just beginning to learn each other's rhythms. The ranch house was as Charlie had described it, stone-built and solid, with a long porch facing west and 2 windows on either side of the front door that were dark at this hour. There was a barn set back to the left with a lantern burning in it, and a bunkhouse a little further on where she could see the glow of lamplight behind a curtain. 3 horses stood in the corral, and one of them raised its head, and regarded them with large dark eyes as the wagon came in. A man emerged from the barn as they pulled up, dark-skinned and compact, wearing a leather vest over a work shirt, and moving with the ease of someone thoroughly familiar with the landscape he occupied. This was Domingo, the cook. Opal would learn, though he was in fact considerably more than that. He had come up from Texas originally, had worked cattle since he was 14, and at 45 was now the person who kept the Red Cedar Ranch actually functioning at a practical level while Oliver managed the business side. "You're late," Domingo said to Oliver, and then he looked at Opal with frank assessment. "You must be the woman from Virginia." He said it without any particular tone, just the plain statement of a person identifying a fact. "Opal Wainwright," she said. He nodded. Domingo raised. "I kept supper warm." He looked at Charlie, who was still more asleep than awake in the wagon bed. "That boy." Oliver lifted Charlie out of the wagon with practiced ease and carried him inside, and Domingo showed Opal to the spare room at the back of the house, which was small and clean with a window that faced east and a quilt on the bed that had been made by a woman's hands, careful and colorful and full of intention. "That was Margaret's work," Domingo said, when he saw her looking at it. He said the name plainly, without drama, the way people in that country often referred to the dead, matter of fact and respectful at once. "Oliver's wife. She made that the first winter they were here. She was good with her hands." He paused at the door. "She was a good woman. And before you think that is a thing you have to fill up, it is not. This house has room enough." Opal looked at him and saw that he meant it precisely as he said it, neither more nor less. "Thank you," she said. After he left, she sat on the edge of the quilt for a long time without lighting the lamp, and she looked out the window at the dark Kansas night and thought about how thoroughly her plans had come undone, and how strange it was that she did not feel quite as frightened as she perhaps ought to. In the morning, she woke to the sound of Charlie arguing with someone in the kitchen about the correct way to fry eggs, and she put on her plain blue dress, the one she had packed beneath the wedding dress, and went to see what she could do to be useful. The days at the Red Cedar Ranch began to accumulate, and Opal had meant what she said about working for her board, so she worked. She was not a delicate woman despite the delicate dress she had arrived in. She had grown up on a Virginia farm and learned early that the gap between what needed doing and what was comfortable was a gap you simply stepped across without ceremony. She could cook, and she could clean, and she could mend, and she could, it turned out, read a ledger with the kind of systematic attention that Oliver had never quite managed because his mind moved in broader strokes than columns of numbers naturally invited. It was the ledger that first changed things between them in a way that went past courtesy. On her third day at the ranch, she had been sitting at the kitchen table working on a letter to the matrimonial agency in St. Louis, laying out her situation with measured precision and asking what options were available to her, when Oliver came in from the barn and sat down at the table with a large and somewhat chaotic collection of papers that he began to arrange with the focused misery of a man doing something he does not enjoy. She watched him for a few minutes. He had spread the papers into several piles that did not appear to correspond to any organizing principle she could identify. He wrote something in a ledger, crossed it out, wrote it again, and then rubbed the back of his neck with the expression of a man considering whether to throw the whole thing out a window. "May I look?" she asked. He looked up as if he had forgotten she was there, which she did not believe for a moment, but which was a polite fiction. "They are ranch accounts," he said. "The accounts for the spring drive." "I can see that. May I look?" He passed her the ledger with a directness that told her he was past caring about pride in relation to this particular problem. She drew it toward her and looked at it for a long, quiet moment. Then she looked at the piles of papers. Then she looked at the ledger again. "Your tallying is off in the third column," she said. "You have added the feed costs twice. And these two entries," she tapped the page gently with one finger, "are the same transaction recorded on different dates, which I suspect is because someone gave you two different receipts for it." Oliver was very still for a moment. Then he leaned over to look at where she was pointing, and she could smell the outdoors on him, sun and grass and horse, and it was unexpectedly pleasant, and she chose not to examine that further. "You are right," he said slowly. He sat back. "How did you see that?" "My father kept accounts when I was young," she said. "Before the war, I used to help him in the evenings. After the war, there was not much to account for, but the habit of reading columns stayed with me." She paused. "If you like, I could help you straighten these out. It would give me something useful to do while I wait to hear back from St. Louis." He regarded her with those honest gray eyes and said, "I would be grateful for that, Miss Wainwright." "Opal," she said, because Miss Wainwright felt like an unnecessary formality for a woman sitting at a man's kitchen table correcting his arithmetic. "We need not be that formal." Something in his face settled, the way a man's face settles when he realizes he has been holding tension he was not aware of. "Oliver," he said. They worked on the accounts together for the rest of that afternoon, while Charlie was out with Domingo learning rope work. And by the time the light failed, they had the ledger straightened, and the papers organized by category and date. And Oliver had made 2 cups of coffee without asking, because Opal had said something about needing it, and he had simply gotten up and made it, which she noticed, and which she thought was a man paying attention. At supper that evening, Charlie told her, with the frank honesty of children, that she was the best thing that had happened to the kitchen since Domingo stopped cooking supper, because Oliver had said he needed him for other work in the evenings. "Papa's cooking is bad," Charlie informed her in a tone of generous objectivity. "Not terrible, just bad." "Charlie," Oliver said. "It is informational," Charlie said. Opal turned her face slightly so that Oliver could not see her smiling. The letter from the matrimonial agency in St. Louis arrived at the end of the 2nd week. She had borrowed a horse from Oliver, a gentle gray mare named Pearl, and ridden into Abilene herself to check the post office, and she had sat on Pearl in the street outside and read it before she rode home. Home. She noticed the word in her mind without commenting on it. The agency's letter was polite and regretful and essentially useless. Harlan Beckett had violated his contract with the agency. They acknowledged this, and they were deeply sorry for the distress caused to Miss Wainwright. However, they were not in a position to provide additional passage funds at this time, as their operating budget was constrained, and the responsibility for the contracted marriage lay with Mr. Beckett personally rather than with the agency. They wished her well and trusted she would find a satisfactory resolution. There was a canned quality to the language that told her this was not the first time they had written a letter like this one. She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and sat with it for a moment, watching Abilene conduct its daily business around her. A man was shouting at a dog that had gotten into his chicken pen. 2 women in proper bonnets were walking quickly past the saloon in the way women did, as if brisk pace could remove them from any association with the place. The train whistle sounded from the depot, and she thought of her trunk still in the baggage claim, which Oliver had arranged for her to leave there until she had determined where she was going. The question of where she was going was less clear than it had been 2 weeks ago. She could go back to Virginia if she could find the passage money, but there was not much in Virginia to go back to. Her father had died in 1870, which was part of why she had answered the matrimonial agency's advertisement in the first place. The farm had been sold for debt. Her only close relation was a cousin in Richmond who had a husband and 5 children, and a house that was already too small, and who had written to say with genuine warmth and genuine regret that there was simply no room. She could try to find employment in Abilene itself. She could read and write and do accounts, and she could cook and she could teach, she supposed. There might be a school that needed a teacher, or a business that needed a clerk, or something else she had not thought of yet. It was not impossible. She thought about the stone ranch house with the porch that faced west, and the quilt with Margaret Quinn's careful stitching, and Charlie with his serious gray eyes and his important hat turning, and Oliver at the kitchen table with the coffee he made without being asked, and the silence on the wagon that had felt like more than silence. She rode Pearl back to the ranch. Oliver was mending fence along the north pasture when she came in, and she could see him a quarter-mile off, methodical and patient with the wire, pausing occasionally to look at something on the horizon in the way that people in open country look at horizons as a habit, checking them the way you check a clock indoors. She unsaddled Pearl and brushed her down and put her in the corral, and she went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and read the agency's letter twice more, and then she went out to the porch and waited. He came in with the late afternoon, sweat-dried and quiet, and he saw her on the porch, and something in his face asked the question before his mouth did. "The agency will not help," she said simply. "I am on my own." He came up onto the porch and leaned against the rail and looked out at the grassland the way he always did when he was thinking something through carefully. "What will you do?" he asked. "I am considering my options," she said. "I may look for teaching work in Abilene. I was told there is a school that has been without a proper teacher since last fall." "That's true," he said. "The schoolmaster left in October. There have been some volunteer efforts, but nothing permanent." He paused. "Abilene is a long ride from here. You would need a place to stay in town." "I am aware of that," she said. The silence stretched out for a moment, full of the sound of wind through the prairie grass and the distant lowing of cattle and a meadowlark somewhere to the south singing with operatic commitment. "You could stay here," Oliver said. He said it to the horizon rather than to her, which she found oddly moving. "Ride in for the school days and come back in the evenings. It is 11 miles, but Pearl can do it easy and the road is fair. Charlie needs someone in the evenings anyway when I am working late, and Domingo does his best, but he will tell you himself that he is better with cattle than children." He stopped. "I am not asking anything beyond what it is, a practical arrangement. You would have your room and your board and whatever the school pays, and you would have your independence." She looked at his profile, the straight line of his jaw and the way he was looking very deliberately at the grass and not at her, and she understood that he was a man who was saying something carefully that he did not quite have the right words for yet, and she respected the honesty of the attempt. "That is a generous arrangement," she said. "It is a sensible one," he said, which was the nearest he was going to come right then to admitting it was also something he wanted. She looked at her hands in her lap. "All right," she said. "I will stay." He nodded, still looking at the horizon, and then he came away from the rail and went inside. And a moment later she could hear him in the kitchen putting the kettle on, and she stayed on the porch a little longer with her face turned toward the western light, feeling something unfamiliar moving in her chest like the first warm day after a long winter. She got the teaching position on her first inquiry, which startled her slightly, and then stopped startling her when she met the members of the Abilene School Board, 3 men who had been arguing about what to do about the vacant teaching position for 8 months, and who received her credentials from the Richmond Female Seminary, with the visible relief of people who have been expecting a cavalry and see it appear on the horizon. The school had 14 students ranging from 6 to 15, and they occupied a single room with uneven floorboards and a stove that worked admirably in winter and was beside the point in June. She loved it from the first day. She had not known she would love it, had thought of it as employment and nothing more, but she found that teaching was the place where the organizing part of her mind and the part of her that cared about people came together in a way that felt entirely natural and right. She rode Pearl in and out along the 11-mile road with the rhythm of a settled thing, and she came home in the evenings to the ranch house, and she helped Charlie with his reading after supper, because he was bright but restless with sitting still, and needed someone to make the words interesting enough to hold him. And she sat with Oliver on the porch sometimes in the blue Kansas evenings when the heat had broken and the stars were coming out, and they talked about everything and nothing in the unhurried way of people who are becoming comfortable with each other's company. She learned things about him in these conversations, Not all at once, but in the way things come out over time when two people are genuinely curious about each other. He had come west from Ohio in 1865, which was the year the war ended, and also the year a lot of men went west, for various reasons. And in his case, the reason was partly that the life he had imagined for himself in Ohio had been interrupted by 4 years of fighting, and when it was over, the interrupted life did not quite fit anymore in the way a coat does not fit after you have changed size. He had worked cattle for other men for 5 years before he had saved enough to start his own operation, and he had sent for Margaret from Ohio, who had been a girl he had known before the war, and they had been happy together in the quiet, determined way of two people building something real. And then she had gotten sick in the third winter, and she had died in January of 1870, and Charlie had been 6 years old, and Oliver had kept the ranch going because it was the only thing that made practical sense, and because Charlie needed it to be kept going. He said all of this without self-pity, which she respected. He asked about her life with the same genuine interest he brought to everything, and she told him about Virginia and her father and the farm, and the years after the war when everything had been harder than it was supposed to be, and about the cousin in Richmond, and the agency advertisement that she had answered on a Sunday afternoon, with the pragmatic hopefulness of a woman who understood that her options were narrowing, and that narrowing options required action. "I am not sorry I came," she said once on one of those evenings, and she meant it more than she expected to. He looked at her then in the particular way he had, that considered and direct way that made her feel seen without feeling examined. "I am not sorry either," he said quietly, and left it there, and she let it sit where he put it in the warm air between them. July moved toward August. The school broke for harvest help, which was when even the children were needed in the fields, and Opal found herself at the ranch full days for the first time, and she discovered that a ranch at its full summer pitch was a different thing from the ranch in its evening hours. She helped Domingo with the preserving because the kitchen garden had come in enthusiastically, and there were more tomatoes and green beans and squash than any reasonable assessment of the situation would have predicted. She helped Domingo because she liked him, genuinely, and because he was a man who had navigated the particular injustice of being brown-skinned in a territory that often treated that as a disadvantage to be managed, and he had done it with a dignity and a dry humor that she found admirable. She and Domingo talked while they worked, which was the best way to talk to Domingo when his hands were busy and his mind was freed up for the kind of conversation he did not often have with people who took the trouble to have it. He told her about growing up in Texas before the war, when Texas was a different kind of complicated, and about the cattle drives north and the men he had worked with, and the landscape of the country from the Rio Grande to the Platte, and what it looked like in different seasons. He was a man of considerable knowledge, and she learned from him the way she learned from books, with pleasure and the sense that her picture of the world was becoming more accurate. "You are good for this place," Domingo told her one afternoon, straightforward as always, tamping down a jar of beans with focused attention. "Oliver is better since you came." "Better how?" she asked, because she was human and she wanted to know. Domingo looked at her sideways with the expression of a man who is not going to say everything he knows. "Less alone," he said, and went back to the beans. It was in the last week of August that things shifted in a way that could not be left in the comfortable warmth of almost understanding. She had been riding Pearl back from Abilene in the late afternoon, the school having resumed its regular session after harvest, when Pearl came up lame on the road about 3 miles from the ranch. Opal dismounted and checked the hoof and found a stone lodged in the frog of the left forefoot, and she worked it out carefully with her knife the way Domingo had shown her. But Pearl was still favoring it, and walking her was the right thing. So she walked her the last 3 miles as the sun went down, and the Kansas sky turned the extraordinary colors it turned in late summer, orange and copper and a deep burning gold. Oliver met her on the road about a mile from the ranch, riding out on his black gelding Cody, and she saw him coming from a distance and felt her heart do something unnecessary that she ignored. He pulled up when he reached her and looked at Pearl's foot and then at her. "She took a stone," Opal said. "I got it out, but she is still favoring it, and I did not want to press her." "No, you did the right thing," he said. He swung down from Cody and took Pearl's lead. "You could take Cody the rest of the way." "I would rather walk," she said. "It is a fine evening and my legs work." He looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded and they walked together, him leading both horses, her walking beside him. And the sun went the rest of the way down while they went that last mile, and the stars began to appear, and the air turned from hot to merely warm, and then to something almost gentle. She could not have said afterward who spoke first, or what the precise sequence of things was, only that at some point in that walk they were talking about something small, the school or the beans or something Charlie had said, and then they were not talking about that at all anymore. She had said something about being glad she had stayed, and he had said that he was glad she had stayed, and then he had stopped walking and she had stopped because he did. He was looking at her in that direct way, but there was something different in it now, something that was past the point of being careful about. "Opal," he said. "Yes," she said, which was perhaps not the most eloquent response, but which was entirely honest. "I did not ask you here intending anything beyond what I said," he said carefully. "I want you to know that. The offer was genuine and I did not set out to." He stopped. "But something has changed for me. Or perhaps it was already there and I was not paying it the attention it deserved. And I think you ought to know it because you deserve to know it, and because I am not a man who says important things sideways when I could say them plain." She looked up at him in the starlight. Both horses stood patiently behind him, one of them breathing out a long, slow breath into the evening air. "Say it plain, then," she said. "I care for you," he said, "considerably. I would like to know if that is something you can return, or if it is something I should put away and not trouble you with again. And I will accept your answer either way without it changing anything practical about your situation here." She stood in the road in the Kansas night and thought about the depot in Abilene on a June afternoon, and a small boy with a hat in his hands and 22 cents, and a ruined plan, and an unasked-for beginning. She thought about stone ranch houses and western porches and coffee made without being asked and ledger books, and the sound of a meadowlark in the morning, and the particular silence of two people learning each other's rhythms. "Oliver," she said, "I have been trying not to care for you for at least 6 weeks, and I am not very good at it." Something broke open in his face, something she had not seen before, a kind of unguarded gladness that was so genuine it made her own chest ache with the pleasure of having caused it. He reached out and took her hand, the way a man does when he is being very deliberate and very reverent about something. "Then we are in agreement," he said. "We appear to be," she said. He held her hand the rest of the way back to the ranch, and the horses walked along behind them content and patient, and the Kansas stars spread out above them in their impossible abundance, and Opal Wainwright felt something complete and solid settle into place inside her chest, like the last stone fitted into a wall that has been waiting for it. September came with the beginning of cooler mornings, and the grass turning its autumn colors, gold and tawny, and a faded red-brown that Opal had not seen before and found unexpectedly beautiful. She had written to her cousin in Richmond to tell her she was well and to give her address, and her cousin had written back with warm relief, and a letter full of her children's doings, and the news that a girl they had both known had married a doctor, which was the kind of news that would have felt pointed 2 months ago and now felt simply like news. She and Oliver moved carefully, the way people move when they know something matters and do not want to rush it past its proper shape. He was courteous in a way that was not formal, attentive in a way that was not showy. He left wildflowers on the kitchen table once, which Charlie reported with disgusted fascination as something he had witnessed with his own eyes and could not fully account for. Oliver had said, without particular embarrassment, that they had been growing along the creek, and he had thought she would like them, and she had said that she did. And Charlie had made the face of a person whose family is behaving in confusing ways, and then gone outside to find Domingo, who was more predictable. Opal loved Charlie in a way that had crept up on her so quietly she had barely noticed it coming. She loved the seriousness of him, and the hat he turned in his hands when he was working something out, and the way he delivered information like dispatches from the front, and the way he had said "Papa sent me" on that first afternoon, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for his father to send him to rescue a stranger from a train depot. She was careful with him, careful not to presume or to push, because she understood that a boy who had lost his mother at 8 was carrying something that could not be simply set aside by the arrival of someone new, and she did not want to ask him for anything he was not ready to give. Charlie Quinn, it turned out, had made his own assessments in his own thorough way and arrived at his own conclusions, and on a Saturday morning in October he came and sat across from her at the kitchen table while she was reading a letter from the school board, and he said, with the gravity of a judge delivering a ruling, "I think you should stay." She put the letter down and looked at him carefully. "I am staying," she said, "at least for now." "I mean for always," Charlie said. "I think you should marry Papa." He paused as if reviewing whether his tone had been appropriate and then added, "If you want to." "I think he wants to. He gets a particular look." "A particular look," she said. "When you come in the door," Charlie said, "he gets it. Like when you see something you did not expect but it is good." He turned his hat on the table in front of him, not wearing it for once, just turning it. "Mama is not here anymore, I know that. And you are not Mama, but I think you are good." He paused again. "And Papa needs someone to look at." She sat with this for a long, quiet moment, this remarkable small person who had crossed a train depot with his hat in his hands and changed the entire direction of her life. "Thank you, Charlie," she said, and meant it in layers. "You are welcome," he said formally, and picked up his hat and went outside. Oliver was in the barn when she found him, doing something involved with a piece of tack that required focused attention, and he looked up when she came in, and the light in the barn was warm and dusty and smelled of hay and horses, and she stood in the doorway and said, "Your son has been to see me." He set the tack down with the expression of a man who can guess what she is about to say next. "What did he tell you?" "That you have a particular look," she said, "when I come in the door." He rubbed his hand over the back of his neck in the way he did when he was embarrassed and trying not to be. "He is observant," he said. "He is," she agreed. "Oliver," she came further into the barn. "I came to Virginia to marry a stranger based on a letter and a contract, and I ended up here, which is nothing like what I planned. And I have had time to think about what I would want if I were planning from the beginning, from a position of knowing something about who I am and what I need, and I find that what I would plan is not so very different from what I have accidentally ended up with." She stopped in front of him. "I want to stay. Not because I have nowhere else to go, because I could make somewhere else to go. I want to stay because I want to be here, with you and Charlie and Domingo and Pearl and the awful stove in the schoolhouse and the porch that faces west and all of it." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the particular look that Charlie had described, and Charlie was right. It was extraordinary. "Is that a yes?" he said, "to a question I have not quite asked yet." "Consider it a preliminary answer," she said, "to a question you should get around to asking." He took both her hands and held them, standing in the warm, dusty barn light with the horses breathing around them and the sound of the Kansas wind against the barn walls, and he said, "Opal Wainwright, will you marry me?" And she said, "Yes, Oliver Quinn, I will." He kissed her then, carefully and thoroughly, the way a man kisses someone he has been patient about and is now done being patient, and she put her hands against his chest and kissed him back with equal commitment. And one of the horses shifted behind him and made a sound of mild commentary, and she started laughing against his mouth, and he did too. And it was not the dignified romantic moment that novels described, but it was real and it was theirs, and she preferred it to anything invented. They were married in November, on a clear, cold day when the sky was that particular winter blue of the Kansas plains, a blue so sharp and clean it looked like something new. The ceremony was at the First Methodist Church in Abilene, which was the smaller of the two churches but had better windows, and Hattie from the restaurant came and cried cheerfully throughout, and the schoolchildren sent a card signed by all 14 of them in various degrees of legibility, and Domingo stood up with Oliver as his witness in a good coat that he had apparently owned for some time and produced for occasions of significance. Charlie stood beside his father with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly at the beginning and then going still as the ceremony progressed. And when the minister pronounced them married and Oliver leaned down to kiss Opal, Charlie made the face of a person witnessing something that was probably fine, and then looked sideways at Domingo with an expression that said this was a lot. Opal wore her blue dress, not the white one, because the white one had been worn under different expectations, and she preferred to begin this marriage with something that was simply hers, chosen for this day without the weight of that other occasion. She carried a small bunch of dried prairie flowers that Charlie had saved from the fall with the secret intention of giving them to her, which she discovered only that morning when he had presented them to her at the kitchen table, with a formality that had reduced her to blinking hard at the ceiling for a moment until she had herself together. They had a wedding supper at Hattie's restaurant, a long meal with more food than was strictly necessary and Hattie's best pie, which justified the reputation, and Oliver's 3 ranch hands came in clean shirts and sat at the long table and ate with the earnest appetite of men who are presented with exceptional food and know it. There was a fiddle player, a young man from one of the neighboring farms who played with more skill than his age suggested, and there was dancing of the uncomplicated frontier variety, people dancing because they were happy and not because they were trying to impress anyone. Oliver danced with her twice, once in the formal pattern and once in a less formal way that was mostly just holding her and moving slowly while the fiddle played something gentle, and she had her head against his shoulder and could feel the steadiness of him. The same steadiness she had felt in the barn and on the wagon road and across the kitchen table, and in every moment they had been in the same room since that first afternoon at Hattie's when he had sat down and wrapped his hands around a coffee cup and looked at her honestly. "Are you happy?" he said quietly, near her ear. She considered the question the way she considered everything, with proper attention. "More than I have been in a long time," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, simply and completely, the way he always said things. The first year of marriage was a year of learning each other in the full dimension of a shared life, which was different from courtship in the way that living in a country is different from visiting it. She learned that he was a deep sleeper but woke quickly and completely, with no transitional state of haziness. She learned that he was an optimist in his fundamental orientation, but expressed it through action rather than statement, the kind of man who builds a fence before the flood rather than hoping for the best. She learned that he had a genuine capacity for stillness that was unusual in a person of his energy, and that she loved that about him, the way he could sit in the evening on the porch and be genuinely present to the experience without needing to fill it up. He learned that she was a morning person in a way that bordered on enthusiasm, that she was better at receiving help than she had initially appeared, because she had been so long in situations where asking for help was not possible that she had forgotten it was an option. He learned that she cried at the end of books, not at sad parts but at endings, because endings meant something was over, and that this was something she found slightly embarrassing and he found entirely understandable. He learned that she had the particular competence of a person who had been managing difficult situations alone for years, and had as a result a very low tolerance for problems that could be solved and were not being solved, which was actually very useful on a working ranch. She and Charlie settled into something that was its own particular thing. She did not try to be his mother, because she was not his mother and he had one already, in memory, and in the quilt on her old bed, and in the garden she had planted behind the house that Opal now tended. What she was to Charlie was something that did not have a precise name, but was no less real for that. She was the person who helped him with his reading, and argued with him about the right way to do things and remembered things, he told her, and held space for him to be complicated, without requiring him to be simple about it. She was, eventually, the person he came to when something was bothering him, and he did not know how to bring it to his father, because fathers and sons sometimes need a middle distance, and she was good at being that. In the spring of 1875, she told Oliver one evening on the porch that they were going to have a child. He was very quiet for a moment, the way he got very quiet when something mattered extremely, and then he looked at her, and his face was doing the extraordinary thing again, the unguarded gladness, and he took her hand and held it for a long time without saying anything, because there was nothing he needed to say that the holding did not already express. The baby came in November of 1875, a boy, born in the stone ranch house in the room that was now properly theirs, with Hattie presiding in the capacity of experienced midwife, because Abilene's doctor was 17 miles out on an emergency call, and Hattie had delivered approximately 30 babies in her life, and was unimpressed by the drama of the situation. She sat in the corner and directed operations with calm authority, and told Opal what to do, and when to do it, and periodically told Oliver, who kept appearing in the doorway with the expression of a man who would very much like to be useful, that he was going to have to wait outside, and that she would let him know when there was something he could do. The baby was healthy and loud and had Oliver's dark hair, and Charlie reported when he was finally allowed in to see the Quinn jaw. Charlie regarded his new brother with the expression of a person encountering a complex new variable in an equation they had been managing successfully, and then the baby grabbed his finger with a grip that was disproportionate to his size, and Charlie's expression changed entirely into something soft and surprised and entirely his own. They named him James Thomas Quinn, Thomas for Oliver's father, James because Opal had always loved the name, and Oliver said he could find no argument against it. He was called Jamesy for the first 2 years and then James for the rest of his life, once he had opinions about the matter. The ranch grew. Oliver bought the adjacent parcel in 1876 when the previous owner moved his family to Colorado, and the Red Cedar expanded to 600 head and 4 hands plus Domingo, who remained the central organizing intelligence of the operation. Opal continued to teach through most of 1876, and then gave it up when the baby made the 11-mile ride a thing she could no longer manage comfortably. But she intended always to return to it, and she did, eventually, in a different form, when the Abilene school district had grown enough to need a second teacher, and she was the obvious candidate. Harlan Beckett left Abilene in 1874, which Opal learned from Hattie with a complete lack of feeling beyond mild interest. He had accumulated debts and left before they were settled, which surprised no one who had known him. He became, in the private cosmology of her life, simply the man whose failure had set everything in motion, and she bore him neither gratitude nor resentment, only the calm acknowledgement that the universe sometimes corrects its own errors by means of other people's bad behavior. In 1878, Opal's cousin from Richmond came to visit, which required the cousin's husband to agree to a 2-week journey west, which he did with the patient love of a man who understood that his wife had been worried about her cousin and needed to see her well. The cousin arrived at the Red Cedar Ranch and looked at the stone house and the porch and the grassland rolling away to the horizon, and Opal coming out the door with James on her hip and Oliver behind her, and Charlie riding in from the south pasture on a horse he had grown into properly now at 14. And the cousin started crying before she was even off the wagon, which embarrassed her husband and delighted Hattie, who happened to be visiting that afternoon and believed strongly in the appropriateness of visible emotion. The cousin said later, privately to Opal, that she had been frightened when she heard about Harlan Beckett and what he had done, and that she had been afraid for months that Opal was in some terrible situation she was too proud to admit to, and that coming here and seeing what had actually happened was the greatest relief of her adult life. "You look different," the cousin said. "You look like yourself, but more so." Opal thought about that for a while and decided it was the best way she had ever heard it put. She did feel more herself. She felt more herself than she had felt since before the war, when she was a girl on her father's farm who had not yet learned that the world was difficult, and who had loved that farm and that life with a child's uncomplicated wholeness. This life was not uncomplicated, but it was whole, and she loved it in a way that was not childlike but was not diminished for that. By 1879, Charlie was 15 and fully a young man in the practical sense, riding and roping alongside the hands, and beginning to understand the business of the ranch in the same way Oliver had taught himself, by doing it and thinking about it and asking questions and making careful assessments. He still turned his hat sometimes when he was working out a hard problem, and Opal loved him the more for the small preserved thread of the boy who had crossed a depot floor with a serious face and changed her life by tugging her sleeve. James was 3.5, and in the absolute prime of the toddler's belief that the world was a place of unlimited personal opportunity, and he expressed this belief at high volume and with considerable physical commitment. Oliver said he had Oliver's energy and Opal's opinions about everything, and Opal said that was an extremely diplomatic assessment, and Oliver said it was the honest one. In the fall of 1879, Opal told Oliver that there was to be another addition to the family. He had learned by now to receive this information without immediately becoming useless with feeling, though he was still not entirely successful at it, and he sat down on the kitchen bench and breathed for a moment and then said, "A third time," with the tone of a man who is registering something wonderful that is also enormous. "You were aware that this was a possibility," she said, entirely without mercy. "I was," he agreed. He reached out and drew her to him, and she sat beside him on the bench, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him in the way she had been leaning into it for 6 years, and which never felt anything other than exactly right. "I am glad," he said. "I am very glad." "Good," she said. "So am I." The second child was born in May of 1880, a girl this time, born in the proper company of the Abilene doctor and Hattie, who came anyway because she was Hattie, and the idea of being left out was not one she entertained. They named her Clara Mee Quinn, and she had Opal's brown eyes and Oliver's determined jaw, and from the first moment she appeared to have a very clear set of feelings about how things ought to be. Charlie rode into Abilene himself the morning after to tell Hattie the particulars, which Hattie had not needed because she had been there, and to pick up the supplies that had been ordered before the baby arrived, and he came back with the supplies and a small carved wooden horse that he had bought at the general store for James, because a new baby required acknowledgement of the older child's feelings, which was a thing he said with the authority of someone who had himself been an older child when someone new arrived and knew whereof he spoke. James received the horse with the gravity due a significant gift, and carried it everywhere for approximately 6 days before he lost it in the creek, and Domingo found it and returned it without comment. The years at the Red Cedar moved the way the best years do, not slowly or quickly, but at the pace of things that are lived fully. There was always work, always the rhythm of the ranch and the school and the seasons, the drives in spring and the harvest in fall and the long winters when the grassland went brown and the sky came low and gray, and the stone house was warm inside and full of the sound of people living. There were hard times as well, because the West was not gentle with its inhabitants, and the prairie did not make exceptions for happiness. There was a drought in 1881 that ate into the herd and required Oliver to sell more cattle than he wanted to at prices that reflected the difficulty of the times, and there were months of careful accounting at the kitchen table late at night, the two of them with the ledger between them, Opal with her pencil and her systematic mind, and Oliver with his broader thinking, working out together what could be managed and what had to wait. They managed. The ranch came through thinner but sound, and in 1882 the grass came back and the cattle prices rose, and they had a good year that replenished the losses. Domingo developed a cough in the winter of 1882 that worried everyone and resolved by spring, which was a relief of considerable magnitude because Domingo was by that point so thoroughly woven into the fabric of the red cedar that the idea of the ranch without him was something none of them wanted to contemplate. He accepted the concern of the household with a gruff affection that was his particular variety of warmth, and when he recovered, he made an extraordinary pot of frijoles and declared that the cough had been exaggerating its importance, which was the most Domingo had ever said about a personal matter. Charlie Quinn turned 18 in 1882, and Oliver sat with him on the porch one evening in a father and son conversation that Opal deliberately did not attend, giving them the privacy of it, but whose general shape she understood from the look on Oliver's face afterward and from Charlie's own settled expression, which was the expression of a young man who has been told something about his future in terms he respects. Oliver had told her about it later, lying in the dark with the night sounds of the ranch coming in through the window. He had told Charlie that the red cedar was his as much as it was Oliver's, that it had been built partly for him from the beginning, that Oliver's intention was for Charlie to be a full partner in the operation as soon as Charlie was ready to take that on, and that being ready meant not just the ranch work but the thinking behind it, the accounts and the planning and the relationships with the buyers and the bankers and the other ranchers. Charlie had listened carefully and then said, "I know all of that, Papa. I have been paying attention." And then he had said, "I think we should buy the Henderson parcel when it comes available. The water rights alone make it worth the price." And Oliver had come in and told Opal this, and they had lain there in the dark and laughed quietly together, the way parents laugh when their child has become more than they planned and less than a surprise. In 1883, Charlie fell in love with a rancher's daughter from the next county named Eliza Holt, a dark-haired, serious girl who could outride most men in the territory, and had opinions about land management that she expressed without apology. She and Charlie regarded each other from the beginning with the mutual assessment of two people who have each decided independently that they prefer a partner who meets them at their level, and the assessment was satisfactory on both sides. Opal liked her enormously. Oliver said she was good for Charlie in the same way Opal was good for him, by which he meant she did not let him get away with anything. By 1884, the Red Cedar Ranch was a different thing from what it had been when Opal first arrived in 1873. It was larger and more prosperous, and it had layers of history accumulated in its rooms and its fields, the particular depth that comes from years of actual living. The stone house had a new room added on the back for Charlie, a workshop of sorts where he kept his accounts and his plans, and argued with himself on paper about the best strategies for the coming year. The barn had been rebuilt larger after the original suffered damage in a storm. The garden behind the house was substantial now, planted each year with the cumulative knowledge of what grew well and what did not. Opal sat on the west-facing porch on an evening in September of 1884, watching the sunset do its extraordinary Kansas thing, spreading gold and copper across the whole enormous sky in a display that never became ordinary no matter how many years you watched it. Clara, for now, was asleep inside, early riser and early sleeper both. James was doing something with a length of rope in the yard that involved a fence post and the theory of the lasso, which Domingo had been teaching him with the patient thoroughness he brought to all instruction. Oliver came out and sat in the chair beside her with his coffee, and they watched the sunset in the comfortable silence of people who have been watching sunsets together for 11 years and know each other's rhythms completely. "Do you remember," she said, "what Domingo told me that first week I was here about the quilt? He told you the house had room enough, Oliver said. He remembered. He remembered things she told him always. Yes, she said. She looked at the grassland going gold in the last light. He was right about that. Oliver reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair, and she turned her hand to hold his back, and they sat like that while the sky went from gold to rose to the deep blue of early dusk, and James gave up on the lasso and came inside dragging the rope behind him with the philosophical acceptance of someone who knows there is always tomorrow. She thought about the depot in Abilene on a June afternoon 11 years ago, the hard bench and the white dress and the 22 cents, and the wall she had been staring at with such concentration. She thought about a small boy with a hat in his hands appearing beside her like something out of a story, and saying, "Papa sent me." She thought about 11 miles of road in the dark, and a porch that faced west, and ledger books and evening coffee and wildflowers on the kitchen table, and 2 children asleep inside, and a man whose hand she was holding, who had told her important things plainly when he could have said them sideways, who had kept his word about everything, who looked at her when she came in the door in the way that Charlie had described, and which she had eventually stopped trying not to notice, and had instead decided was the most remarkable thing she had seen in her entire life. The evening star appeared above the western horizon, the first and brightest, hanging there like a promise kept. "Oliver," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am very glad the horse threw that shoe." He was quiet for a moment, and then he laughed, the full genuine laugh that she had first heard somewhere in the 3rd week of her stay at the ranch, when she had said something at supper that surprised it out of him, and which she had been provoking intentionally ever since, because it was one of the things she loved most about him, the way his whole face changed when something truly struck him. "So am I," he said. "God help me, so am I." The stars came out one by one over the Kansas grassland, as they had every night since, before anyone had been there to see them, and the ranch settled into the particular piece of a place that has been worked and tended and loved over time. And Opal Quinn sat on her west-facing porch and held her husband's hand and watched the night come in, and felt the completed whole of a life that had arrived at precisely the right place, having come by exactly the right road, which had been no road she had planned, but which had been, in every way that mattered, her own. Inside, Clara woke briefly and called out, and before Opal could rise, Oliver was already on his feet with the ease of long practice, and she heard him in the hallway talking to their daughter in the low, steady voice he used for midnight fears, and Clara's voice settled into quiet, and then Oliver's footsteps came back, and he came out onto the porch and sat back down beside her and picked up his coffee again without any comment on the interruption. "She is all right?" Opal asked. "She dreamed about a horse," he said. "She wanted to know if it was Pearl." Pearl had died peacefully the previous winter at a good age for a horse, and they had all felt it, the children included, because Pearl had been at the ranch as long as James had been alive and longer. "What did you tell her?" Opal asked. "I told her it probably was Pearl," Oliver said, "and that Pearl was fine because she was dreaming, which meant she could go wherever she wanted." Opal looked at him in the dark. She thought he was probably the best man she had ever known, not in the sense of the most impressive or the most accomplished or the most anything, but in the most fundamental sense, the sense of a person who was genuinely and consistently trying to do right by the people in his care and succeeding at it more than most people did. "That was a good answer," she said. "I have my moments," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. In the morning, Charlie and Eliza came to breakfast, as they did most mornings now that Charlie's quarters were attached to the house, and James talked at length about the lasso and the fence post, and the improvements he intended to make in his approach, and Clara demanded to know if Domingo was making the flapjacks with the honey or without, because she had strong feelings about honey, and Domingo appeared in the kitchen doorway, and said she could have them whichever way she liked, and she should stop worrying about it. And Charlie said something to Oliver about the Henderson parcel coming on the market, and Oliver looked at Opal across the table, and she looked back at him, and they were both already thinking the same thing. This was what a life looked like, she thought. Not one extraordinary moment, but the accumulation of ordinary ones, each of which was, on examination, not ordinary at all. The morning light through the east window, coffee that someone made without being asked, a boy who had grown into a man who had his father's eyes, a girl who asked good questions, a husband who said important things plainly, a table full of people. She had come west in a wedding dress with 22 cents in her purse to marry a stranger who had not bothered to come and meet her, and she had sat alone in a depot in Abilene, Kansas, in the summer of 1873, and a 9-year-old boy had tugged her sleeve and said, "Papa sent me," and the rest of her life had arranged itself from that point outward like light from a lamp, reaching into every corner of the room. She picked up her coffee cup and looked at her family around her table and thought, without needing to say it to anyone, that she was the luckiest woman she had ever personally known. Outside, the Kansas morning was opening itself up to the east with its usual lack of modesty, painting the whole sky gold, and the grassland caught the light and gave it back in every direction, and the meadowlark was singing its territorial and magnificent song from the fence post by the barn, and the Red Cedar Ranch went about the business of being itself, full of work and argument and laughter, and the patient deep satisfaction of a life built properly, built honestly, built by two people who had found each other by improbable and fortunate accident, and had made the most remarkable use of it. And Oliver Quinn looked up from his conversation with his son and across the table at his wife, and got the look on his face that Charlie had described correctly when he was 9 years old, the look of seeing something he had not expected but which was entirely good. And Opal Wainwright Quinn looked back at him with the same thing in her own face, the same gladness, the same completeness, the same full-hearted recognition of a thing that was exactly right. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.